The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi folks, this is Travis McGrath from Exago. Welcome to this month's Technical Support Lab. Thanks for joining us, and just to make sure everyone can hear me okay, you should be looking at a screen that says Exago Support Lab, Action Event, Sample Custom Dialog. Just put a yes or a thumbs up or something in the question panel on the bottom right, just to show that I'm coming through loud and clear. Perfect. And so that question panel on the bottom right, at any point as we go along today, if you do have any questions, please use that to put them there. If they're relevant to the group as a whole, of course, we'll stop, we'll answer those questions. I'm joined by my colleagues, Emma and Alex, who will be able to assist with questions there as well. Great, so let's dive right into it. Today's going to be a fairly technical lab. So what we want to do is show a hands-on example of a action event, one of our extensibility features. And action events, I'll describe what they are in just a little bit, but to start out with, I do want to preface that this lab will go through a little bit of JavaScript and sort of like half a chili pepper worth of HTML here, if this were sort of a technical menu, right? So we'll have a little bit of code we show, but it's not too deep. Okay, so with that, the first question is, well, what are action events? And the definition here from the book would be action events are extensibility features that store JavaScript code snippets that allow you as the integrator of Exago to customize the client-side experience. Now, you might be saying, huh? Right? That was kind of some jargon. So what it really means is that this is a JavaScript code that you write that lets you do a couple of things. It lets you modify the behavior of Exago's UI to add to existing dialogues or menus within Exago's UI. And in this example, we're going to show make cells of a report that a user can click and take some action with. That's why we call them action events. So the goal here is to give you a way to customize the user experience. And this is all happening on the front end and the client side, so that's why we're doing things here through JavaScript. So now how does an action event work? Well, just like our server events, which we've shown in the past, action events are going to be written in C#, VB, or server-side JavaScript, so they're going to be compilable and run within the Exago application. What they're going to do is they're going to store some JavaScript in a method called session info. That's the active Exago session .javascript action, as its name sort of implies what it is, set JS code. So this is the final thing, the most important thing that the action event is doing on the server is it's setting the JavaScript code that's going to run in the browser. And the first time a action event is run, as mentioned, it's going to run on the server and it's going to set up that JavaScript code. Then in the UI of Exago, when a user clicks on an element or an element is loaded or at certain points in the front-end user experience, the JavaScript that the action event defined earlier will run and sort of do its thing. So from an abstract point of view, that's a sort of brief description of action events. So I just want to pause there and see if there are any questions so far. Okay, great. So it looks like folks were not seeing the slides that were being shown. So I'll just real quick, briefly go through that again. Sorry about that. So the action event dialog, this is our lab. As mentioned, a little bit of JavaScript and HTML. Action events, as mentioned, were the extensibility feature used for storing JavaScript code snippets. And in a practical term, what that means is action events create JavaScript that modifies Exago's user interface, can add to existing dialogues and menus. And on today's example, we'll be seeing create reports that have clickable cells that then do custom things. They're written in C#, VB, and JavaScript. On the server side, they run when they're first loaded. And they store using this method here. We'll see this in the code in just a second. they store JavaScript to run in the browser. So let's look at a real life example. And I believe now everyone can see my screen should be moving along with me there. So the real life example we're going to look at is we have a simple report that shows inventory of items in stock. What we want to be able to do is for a user to click on a particular item or product and launch a dialog that lets them order more. So if they're running low on something, they can not only look at a report, but looking at that report, they can then immediately take action without having to go to a different page or, call someone or send an email or anything. They can immediately see a clickable item, click on it, and launch into a custom dialog. So what's that look like visually? Well, we have a report, and we'll show this report in Exago in just a moment. And in that report, we have a list of products, and you can notice that for some of the products, I think we have a cutoff of the units in stock maybe under, say, 30. If the units in stock and on order are under 30, it's highlighted, it looks clickable, and we have a nice little sort of dramatic icon here to say, hey, you're running out. And the user clicks on that cell, and it pops up a custom dialog. In this case, we've kept that dialog really simple. It just says, restock, whatever the product name is, and then gives you an option of 2 vendors, again, just using very simple examples. Okay, so that's what the end user experience is going to look like. So let's look at some code. And to do this, we're going to first jump over to the code itself. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio. Our examples today are going to be written in C# and, of course, JavaScript. So we have a separate project. We're calling this Exago Extensibility. Folks may have downloaded some samples off of our site before where we have a project with this name. So this may look a little familiar to some folks. And within this project, we have a class called actionevents.cs, keeping the naming convention pretty simple here. And what we're going to do is we're going to define a method. So we define a public method, and that method is going to return something within the Exago namespace called a JavaScript action. Now we're calling this method show product restock dialog, again, trying to keep everything as intuitive as possible. And this method is going to receive a session info object. This is a way for our action event to know who the user is, if we wanted to, make the dialog custom based on who they are, what context they're running something in. A lot of useful information is going to be here. Now, looking at this method, you may say, hey, this is only 4 lines. I don't see any JavaScript. What's the deal, right? So a couple of things I'll note. First, I added a little debugger statement. So if we ever wanted to come in here and step through this as it runs, we could uncomment this line, rebuild, and be able to actually step through this to make sure everything is running smoothly. But I like my example, so I'm not going to do that here. The first thing we're doing in this example is we're loading the JavaScript code. Now, we could create some C# code here that concatenates together JavaScript. But folks who program know this, writing code that writes code can be a little syntactically tricky and kind of a headache. You don't get some of the nice parts of working within an IDE. So what we've done here is we've actually created a separate JavaScript file. And this load.js code method, I'll just jump into the definition. All it does is it looks at the name of the file it's looking for, and it goes and finds that within the project's resources. This is a Visual Studio thing that lets us load that JavaScript into the resources. So if we use this project as a DLL, which we are, we can easily grab that content here, and it just returns whatever's inside of this file. So going back here, we'll then jump over to the JavaScript function, which is where the real heart of what we're doing is. So this is what we're going to be loading into our action event, and this is the JavaScript to define a method that we're calling show product restock dialog. Again, if we want to step through it, I left a debugger statement in place. So as this runs, we can open up the browser utilities step through this as it runs to see what's going on. But pretty simply in JavaScript, all we're doing is first we're getting a product name. As we noticed in that visual example at the top of the custom dialog, in order to order more of something, we need to know what that something is. So what we're doing is we're using a client info object. We've talked about this in past labs, that the client info object is our Exago's provided context for what the user's clicked on, who the user is. And in this case, what we're doing is we're looking at the element they clicked on, and we're grabbing the name of that product. Then we're making two URLs. So here, since we're using Google and Amazon as our sales providers, of course, this is all customizable. So here, we wouldn't have to use those providers. We could really have this dialog show anything we want. But for this simple example, we're just concatenating together some URLs to bring you to the Google Shop and Amazon Smile. Then we're adding some images. Now, we're loading these images from within the configuration of Exago, where we just stored them, right? And these are just those icons we saw a moment ago. With all these variables defined, then this JavaScript is going to create a simple HTML dialog. So here we'll see that it's just building HTML as a string, and it's using some div tags, line breaks, real basic HTML stuff here. The one more advanced thing that it's doing is within client info, that context object provided by Exago, it's calling a method to get language data. So as we've covered in past labs, Exago supports multi-language. And of course, we want our extensibility features to have that same support. So here, anywhere in our dialog where we're showing text, like the title across the top or any prompting language, we can use client info to pull that text from the language files that we've covered in previous labs, so that even our extensibility features can be translated and support multi-language, seamlessly with our host application and of course Exago itself. So this top line here is just creating the title, the prompt text, and then here we're adding as clickable items those images we mentioned earlier, and again giving them some alternative text in case those images don't load for any reason. So really just creating a very simple HTML dialog. And we're storing that in our HTML variable. And then the last thing this method does is it uses client info. There's a helper method here called load HTML dialog. We're passing in the content of the dialog that we want and setting some properties such as height, width, the title text, again, still using that get language data as a helper here. And if we want to, at the bottom of our dialog, we automatically get a OK and a cancel button. Now, in our case, we're not really worried about doing anything when a user clicks OK, because we're just providing them links out to other sites. But if our dialog needed to confirm a user selection, it can, if it wants to, call back to the server. And so this is a really powerful part of action events, is that not only are they running on the client in the browser, but they enable you to do server-side callbacks. So if you want your custom dialog to call back to your server, maybe make some changes to the database, or kick off workflows or call other processes in your host application, that's something that we absolutely can do and support. But in this simple example, we've left commented out just to be as simple as possible. So that's all the JavaScript we have here, right? Just 20 or so lines, pretty simple. And what we're doing is we're loading that up to our, let's jump back to our original method. So we're loading this up, and that defines the JavaScript method. Then we're saying once you've defined the method, call it, so actually launch the dialog. And now that we have all the JavaScript we want, we're telling Exago, hey, store this JavaScript and use it on the server. No, sorry, use it on the client. So have this available, right? And we're returning that JavaScript action as we want. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions. And this is just defining the custom code that we're about to use. And then we'll show how it connects to Exago and how it ends up on your report impacting the user. Okay, great. I don't see any questions coming in, so let me jump back here. So very briefly, I'm just going to open up our admin console. And of course, in this case, we have our admin here is password protected, so I just need to log in there. So our action events, like our other extensibility features, are found down here. But first, before we jump into creating a new action event or showing the one that we already have created for today, what we have to do is look at our source. And so if we want, we can write our action events right in the admin console. But because we're trying to take advantage of, some of the niceties of programming within an environment such as Visual Studio or, your favorite IDE, we want to store these outside of the configuration of Exago. And so what we're going to do here is create a source. And in this case, we already have it for us. Just give it whatever name we like. We're keeping ours very simple and just saying, action event DLL. Set its type to assembly. So in this case, we're saying, hey, we're pointing at a DLL as opposed to a traditional database. And provide a connection string. So here, very simply, that's just assembly equals and then the path to the project that we're building our example in, as well as the class within the example. And I mentioned that earlier here. So that's just our DLL.ActionEvents is what we named our class. So now we have our data source, and we can go to our action events, and we could either create a new action event, or in this case, we actually already have the one we want. So here, I'm just going to open it up. And what this lets us do is define the event. So we give it a name. Again, if we want to write custom code, we can certainly do that here, but programming, I find in an IDE is a little bit easier for us. So instead, we can select from any of our assembly data sources we've defined, and we can choose a method. So in this case, we've already got this here. We chose the method, of course, that we just showed in the code. And we might say, well, when should this action event fire? And there are a couple of choices here. So we can set it to have a type, so when a user clicks on something, or maybe when something is first loaded, or maybe it doesn't have a type at all. In this case, we want to capture a user's click, so we're going to set the event type to click. And then we have two choices. We can either set a global event, so this is whenever something happens in the front end. So for example, whenever a user goes to save a report or maybe edit a report, right? We have lots of choices here. But in this case, we don't want a global event. We're thinking about a specific cell of a report. So if we want, we could assign it to a specific user interface item in Exago. Say, for example, if we wanted to capture whenever a user clicked on the bold button, maybe we wanted to make something super extra bold or something like that. But again, we're thinking of a specific individual report, so we're not going to set either of these here. And from an admin side, it's really all the setup we need. With one more small thing, in the feature UI section of our general settings, we do have a setting called Show Events Window, and we're just going to make sure this is true. This is one of the more advanced features for users, only really if you set up some action events such as these. So normally this will be false, but of course easy to flip to true, and as we've talked about in previous labs, something that you can set dynamically through the API. Okay, so just want to pause there. Sorry. I said show events window. This is for global events on the report. But in this particular case, since we're looking at cells on the report, and thanks to my colleague Alex for pointing this out, we're actually going to use the show link action setting, which is also such a true in our environment already for us. So both of these are sort of advanced items that let you set action events for the report individually or for cells of a report individually. Okay, so with that, it's now going to be available as we design our report. We've defined our action event and we've set it up here to be defined. So I'm going to log into our sort of demo environment just very briefly and launch Exago just to showcase that. That's a great question. So the question came up, was there any danger of flipping the show events window to true, especially if users are not technical in nature? So yeah, so this is a feature that we would only really recommend a user have set to true if they were technical, or in some cases, you may want to set it to true as you build some standard reports if you want to link actions. Those linked actions will remain there even if you set this to false. So you could set this up and then not worry about other users sort of misusing those linked actions by setting it to false for non-technical or maybe non-power users. So that's a great question. Okay. So what we have, I'm just going to edit our advanced report here. And we'll see is a pretty easy advanced report. It doesn't even have any grouping. We're just simply showing the detail section of a report. And this is showing our products, how many units in stock, etc. The two pieces that I do want to point out, and we've covered both these topics in support labs and end user support labs previously, we have a simple formula here that's saying, hey, if the units in stock plus the units on order are less than 30, load a warning image, otherwise just load a simple blank image. And we have some conditional formatting here using the same formula saying, hey, if we're running low, change the color of this cell so that the text pops out, make it bold and underlined. This way it looks like something we could click on, right? So that's our simple conditional formatting. And if I run the report, it'll show, and I'll be able to scroll around, find the one I like. And in this case, I've already got it set up to click, but I'll show you how we got that to happen now. So because we have that flag that says show linked actions, in our toolbar across the top, we can select a cell, and then you'll notice that there's a little icon that has sort of a click indicator or some action. It's got a little popping icon, and we'll click on that, and we can add, or in this case, it's already here, but I'll just remove it for the sake of showing it. We can add an action event, and it'll let us select from our clickable action events. Now, I have a couple of other ones that we've used here, but in this case, we're just showing the one that says, on cell click _ show restock event. We named it pretty obviously so that it was easy to find, and it tells us what to do. And then we click OK, and then when we run a report, of course, this is only going to work when we run our report in HTML, right? If we export this to something static like a printable document, of course you can't click on a piece of paper. But here we can click and it will launch our custom dialog for us. And of course those links are going to pass in and appropriately pass the product name. So if we needed to, I guess, order more coffee in this case, we can certainly do so here. So let me just pause and see if there are any questions about setting up a action event that's clickable on the cell, or how we defined and built the action event in this example for that custom dialog. Okay, well, let me just mention, a great question came in, which is, how does this differ from, say, using a hyperlink function? So let me just jump in here and show. So in our formula editor, it's a great question. We have, under other formulas, we have our hyperlink function. And the hyperlink function lets you specify a URL and some display text. So if you wanted to, say, take one of the URLs that we had previously, so let's grab the Google one this time, and concatenate that with, say, the product name. You could certainly do that, and we can even have it only display the product name, so the full URL. That would certainly work, but what this would do is this would immediately take you from clicking on the name to one of those providers. But you may not want to have it just be a URL. You may want to do something more complex, or custom dialog here, in which case a URL may not cut it, or you may want to call back to your server and have it tie more tightly into the workflow of your host application, in which case that URL may not be technically the way you want to do it, because the URL can't make those server-side callbacks necessary. But that's a great question. The question was, can you specify an action event for an entire row, or would you have to apply it cell by cell? So that's a great question. I believe you would have to apply it cell by cell, but it would be very easy to do here. You could even use the shift and select the multi-select here and select all the cells. Okay, well, as the last few questions come in here, let me first of all, of course, say thanks as always for joining us on today's lab, but also let me give a shout out. So for March's labs, on the 7th, my colleague Emma is going to be doing our end user topic for chain reports. And on the 22nd, we actually don't know our topic yet because we're going to let you folks vote. So following today's lab in just a moment, as you exit, there will be a survey asking how it went, and the last question on there will be a chance to vote on the next technical labs topic. So the first one is going to be my colleague Nick. He has another action event similar to this one, but doing a couple more interesting things with server-side callbacks to click on a report output and actually call back to the server, create a one-off schedule, and email a report. The alternative to that here is to cover security settings. So do an overview of important security settings, sort of do a quick review, and just make sure we have a lab that covers those so folks are aware of them, and you can go back and do a quick check of your own system here. So that's what we put up for a vote here. But the other question on the survey is, of course, are there any topics you'd like to see? Many of the topics we've covered so far have come from folks who attend giving feedback. So if there are any other topics from a technical point of view, or even an end user point of view you'd like to see, please feel free to include those on the survey. So with that, let me just check if there are any other questions. Doesn't look like there are. So let me say again, thanks for attending and happy reporting.